As you might be seeing, this is not a Spielbergian type of production, but hopefully it will be good. And Rolly and I were talking before we started this, and the question came up, who are we to talk about something so sacred and so gorgeous and so holy is what we're going to talk about. Then the other question was, well, who are we not to talk about it? So anyway, this is a great honor and a privilege and a blessing to be able to talk about this. And I thought maybe I would just give a few opening remarks about perhaps perspectives that are represented in this panel. And of course, this will be a dialogue and communication as we flow on. And I have no idea where this is going. But perhaps maybe we talk about what is integral Christianity, just to define terms, and then let her rip. And I'm very much a 6 on the Enneagram, and I just go with the flow. And show me the first 3 chords, and I'll make up something and just see what emerges. So, and plans are what you do when God, doesn't indicate otherwise. So amen, Lord. Be here with us. So I want to, I'll introduce your perspectives, which is probably kind of strange, but anyway, I will. My perspective here is I came from a Catholic background, and my first spiritual awakening happened when I was 11 years old, 11 or 12. Anyway, I think it was 68. And then from Catholicism, I went into a rather kind of fundamentalist Christian thing, and I dropped out of school when I was 14 and tried to live according to the Gospels for Sakal and follow Jesus, and live according to, it was an interesting time, the 60s, early 70s. And eventually the organization I was associated with turned into a rather toxic, cultic type, yucky thing, and I left that in my early 20s and started trying to reconstruct my world, and now what? And through the process of my current spiritual growth and awakening, I rediscovered Christianity. Not because of what anybody said. Well, no, because of what a lot of people said, what Ken Wilber said, and what Rolly said, and different teachers and influences I had, but mainly from my spiritual practice. The whole Christ thing just started coming back online, not bidden. Mind you, I wasn't looking for it, but there it was. So I feel myself coming back into this Christianity, whatever that is, in an integral way, as kind of scary and kind of full of grace and kind of just glorious at the same time. So I guess I represent as many of us people who have left the tradition for various reasons, who've been wounded or couldn't find anything that was speaking to them at their current developmental level, and now I'm returning. And with fresh eyes and an open heart and a lot of excitement. And this is Father Edmund Grace, Society of Jesus, and he are Jesuit anyway, for those that don't know what that means. And he has been a friend of ours for the last 5 years, and more than a friend, feels like family at this point. And it's just very fortuitous that he's here to represent that perspective in this conversation. And here is Rolly Stanich, which one of my when I was coming back to reowning this deep Christian part of myself, was like, oh, okay, well, Rolly, if he's a Christian, then color me Christian, and a beautiful model of love. It's like who was it said, there's nothing wrong with Christianity, but so few people have tried it. Now when I saw Rolly, I was okay, man, there's some real grace and beauty and love here. And Leslie Hirschberger, we connected about 4 months ago at a get-together of the graduate school in JFK, the Integral program, and we started talking about a lot of things, but we really connected on the integral Christianity thing. And Leslie comes from a Catholic background, but also is here to represent the feminist point of view in this whole dialogue. So that's my opening statement, and who would ever like to open from that? Or maybe I should pose the question. We're saying this is about integral Christianity. And I might add that Rolly has worked, and then I'll be quiet, but worked with Ken very closely. Ken Wilber, who is the outstanding kind of genius that brought all this integral thinking into the world for 5 years and then was in charge of Integral Spiritual Center, which was this deeply ecumenical movement of spiritual teachers in different traditions, and has been really a pioneer in bringing integral Christianity into the world, and is currently envisioning and writing and creating a book about that. So maybe I'll just hand it off to you, Roland.
Thank you. When I look at my own life, I've been Catholic from the beginning, grew up with beautiful Catholic parents, and I understand why almost everybody had to leave that tradition at some point. It's so clear to me why that happened. And for me, for some reason, that never happened. And if any of you have heard of Father Thomas Keating, I saw him speak when I was 20, and it changed my life. I can't say where it would have gone if I hadn't seen this man talk, but also walk. He preaches sermons by the way he walks, and when I saw him and experienced him at that point in my life, I saw I'm already home. I don't need to go anywhere. So for the next 5 years or so, I began thinking, well, how does my life look then if I'm to remain in this tradition and practice deeply in this tradition and share it, and how do I go about doing that? And I found myself in Egypt in 1994, and had a couple extra days before returning home. And I'd heard about this sort of mystical monastery called Sinai, St. Catherine in Sinai, and this is at the foot of Mount Horeb and where the burning bush is, and it was a place that really called to me. So traveled from Cairo. We took a bus from Cairo and ended up going under the Red Sea. There's a tunnel under the Red Sea where the Jews were supposedly to have gone through the Red Sea. They have a tunnel there now, so I just remember being on the bus and going under the Red Sea, and then in the Sinai, and it was just the most magnificent evening and night. I hiked up with a Jewish couple, and we had a beautiful hike up, and at the top we met a Bedouin Muslim who had a little tea house on top. And so I sat with this Jewish guy and this Muslim guy, looking, and we could see forever from up there, and just talking about the world and everything making sense and making peace. And I remember the Jewish guy taking out a pack of cigarettes. I had one of the only cigarettes I've ever had, because that's the only thing you could do on top of this mountain was to have a smoke. And then the Jewish couple went back down, and the Bedouin Muslim guy went to sleep. And I just found myself alone on this mountain and thinking, if Moses came up this mountain and got the 10 Commandments and everything else that he got, then maybe I would know what to do with life. Maybe I would get some indication of what I'm here for. And I just looked up at the stars that Abraham would have looked up. It was interesting in the Gospel tonight. And felt that God was making a promise to me. And received the most direct communication I've ever had, the thing that I've understood the most clear of anything in my entire life, and that was love. It wasn't a word, it was a way of being that was communicating. It was to love. And I remember thinking of the words of the Elton John song, the last song. And the chorus goes, I never thought I'd lose, I only thought I'd win. I never dreamed I'd feel this fire beneath my skin. I can't believe you loved me. I never thought you'd come. I guess I misjudged love between a father and his son. And so I was in sort of ecstasy the whole night, knowing what the purpose is and not needing to know any more. And I never received any more, and walked down from that mountain knowing that that's what I had to do in life. And again, I realized I was at home in the tradition, because the tradition is the way of love, and I would say the way of embodied love. And even in ancient Hinduism, there are a number of paths, or a number of yogas to the divine, and there's the yoga of work, the yoga of knowledge, gnosis, the yoga of love. And in modern Hinduism, they would point to Christianity as a shining way of love. And that maybe never in history was there a person who so fully loved, and who so fully in his heart united heaven and earth, and you're tied in a knot in in that heart. And then he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's the very way, and that means that we're to follow in that way, to follow in those footsteps. And in the Gospel of John says, you will do these things that I have done, and you will do greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father. And I think he wants us to take that seriously. So, coming down from that mountain, I knew that I was already on the way, because it was the way of love. And in my life, I'm just amazed by the gap between the love that I feel called to, and I feel we're all called to, and the love that I've been able to love so far. But I think it's that very gap that keeps me and keeps us going, seeing who we could be, or seeing who we really are in the eyes of God. Something Father Thomas said, and I've been a student of his for a long time, he said, the whole purpose of the Christian tradition is to have the same experience of the Father, or ultimate reality, as Jesus did, as Abba, as Father, or as Daddy. That's the whole purpose. And then you look back and you see that the tradition has done everything else but that. But that's the message, and the message is uncorruptible, and the message is incorrupt, that we are to love. So then again at around 30, I had the great blessing of reading Ken Wilber, and again another intervention that just deepened my own practice of Christianity, because I could see it in the context of evolution, and I could see how a promise like, you will do greater things than these, could actually be true. In an evolutionary universe, that's actually possible. But without it, I wouldn't be able to make any sense of that promise. That's how that promise can make perfect sense. So, I've just seen that the path is bottomless. A teaching that Ken Wilber has elucidated about 3-4 years ago, which again was very, very liberating. He just said, okay, I've been looking through perspectives. First person perspective, second person perspective, third person perspective. And at the time I had a bit of an inferiority complex, because the community was so Buddhist. I was the token Catholic, the token Christian. And seeing these profound non-dual realizations coming out of the East, and wondering, does my own tradition go to that depth? So what Ken said is, look through your first person, second person, or third person perspective, and look all the way up, and there you will find God. The line in the Quran, which is really interesting, God's is the East, and God's is the West. Therefore look to the East or the West, and there you shall see the face of God. And Ken was just saying the same thing, but look in your first, second, or third person perspective. Look all the way up, and there you will see God. And Christianity was a natural second person perspective, where you enter into a relationship with a great other, or with a lover and beloved, and you realize yourself to be the beloved, and you realize the saints, they weren't the ones who loved the most, they were the ones who realized they were the beloved, and just couldn't help but act from that. They didn't even have to try to love, they just recognized their nature as beloved of God, and moved from there. So that teaching of the three faces of spirit was absolutely beautiful. And then I realized again that this tradition goes all the way down, goes all the way up. And what are the higher reaches of entering into a relationship with lover and beloved? And I don't know if we know, but that's the calling of the path, that's the promise of the path. So from where I stand, I just see an incredible merging of this ancient way of love and of the very latest in postmodern thought. Beautiful confluence of these two, and a real way forward that respects 2,000 years of tradition and respects the very latest in scientific and philosophical thought. And I feel incredibly privileged to be standing at that intersection, and then to meet you and all of you at that intersection, and to imagine, where does this path of love lead? It's the huge blessing of my life to have somehow gotten that command on the mountain, and not knowing how to go forward, but 15 years later, finding myself in this room, it's just absolutely perfect. When I look back, when I look forward, it's always nebulous and foggy, but looking back, it's absolutely perfect. So I can't say what integral Christianity is, but I can say that I'm sort of seeing that promised land, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's deeply mystical and contemplative, for sure. And one of the things that I heard you say, and maybe this will take us to what we're talking about. And I always quote you on this. In fact, I quoted it to you. I don't even know if you remember. You said it. But you said it one time. It's beautiful. Is that we all see God through colored glasses. And of course, those of you familiar with integral theory, there are spiral dynamics, or Ken later, giving us new colors. Developmentally, that we see, we understand the divine, we understand the mystery through whatever developmental level we are. So instead of having just a kind of this or that, saved or not saved, black or white, we realize that there's developmental levels, and that just adds a huge depth of understanding and compassion, so that you can accept people and their perceptions of God and not try to necessarily yank them to yours wherever they're at. And just adding, as I've done in working with integral recovery or integral treating of addiction, just to realize there's stages of development. Just to add that little piece is phenomenally profound, and it promises hope of healing the broken parts in the way that the Christian body has been so fractured over the centuries.
And in a sense, there's a second coming, and another second coming, and another second coming, and every time
Yes.
we're at a developmental level, there's a knocking at the door, and the knocking at the door, in my experience, is Christ. So if I'm in a place where Christ is, I'm seeing Christ mythically. So it's the human man, Jesus, who is the divine person, Christ, who walked on the earth, and he's the Savior, and you must accept his name and profess his name, or you're condemned to hell. But then there's a knocking that's saying, wait a minute, is this maybe a little bit bigger than we're seeing? Or maybe his teaching's universal, and does maybe the Buddha have something to say? But there's that knocking, and that knocking, in my experience, is Christ. And then you can make that move, and then again, at the edge of your love, there's that knocking again, and from a higher place. So what I've come to see the second coming now is many comings. Christ meets us at our limit, at our developmental limit, at our stage limit, at every limit. There's that knocking and that invitation to move forward and develop, and to remove the boundaries that you've set to your love, because that's what the ego is, and that's what the soul is. They're just boundaries on how much we allow ourselves to love. And there's that second coming at every stage and state.
I use the St. Francis prayer a lot in my inner prayer work, and there's the last part, and dying we are born again to eternal life, and it's kind of evolved in my mind, that dying again and again and again we are born again and again and again to eternal life again and again. It just seems like a process of ever deepening, and where the bottom is on that, I have no clue.
There's a part of me that, and this doesn't happen often, of just feeling speechless after listening to you, because this notion of love, almost feeling it inside of my body right now, and being able to celebrate Mass with Edmund here, and because I've considered myself oft-times a Catholic in exile. And when I think of the Enneagram holy ideas, that we embody qualities of being, and the 9 embodies holy love. And so it's a reminder for me to hear your experience. Because for me, the embodiment is holy work, of staying with one single focus. And one time Helen Palmer said to me, you've feel like you've moved along this path so quickly because of, and it shocked me when she said this, because Helen's a 30-year Zen practitioner. She said, your husband and your tradition. your Catholic tradition. And at that time I was just feeling this state of exile, because my voice as a woman is ignored, and there's so much pain in that, and sitting in Mass and not hearing gender neutral language, and the church itself, there's just been so much pain. And I work with women in women's groups where they experience that kind of pain, and taking them into the sacred feminine has been really healing for them. And so listening to you is the experience that I had when I went to Integral Contemplative Christianity in October, was it 2006? Because there was this part of me that kept feeling the need to leave. Because I had been a member of a parish for 30 years. And in 2000, the beloved pastor I had he was transferred, as happens in Catholic parishes. And somebody was brought in who was really lovely, but very wounded, and ended up taking like $1 million from our parish. And just feeling this kind of, just this breakdown. It was like, I felt like the Enneagram was dismantling my interiors. And the theology degree, the Jesuits who, damn you Jesuits, they don't teach you what to think, they teach you how to think. And to start to ask questions. And it was like my exteriors were being dismantled in the theology program in this real rational way. Encountering the historical Jesus, encountering all of the myths that just felt like, and I didn't know what I had left. And felt this really dark night of not knowing, and I had been doing, with no teacher, just kind of listening to tapes and kind of wandering through Buddhist meditation practice up in my room every day, and sometimes just missing Jesus. But I was also angry a lot too. And so I just didn't know where to go. When I went out to Integral Contemplative Christianity, there were people from every tradition out there. And there was you, and Father Thomas, and Brother David, and sitting in that room full of people, we were doing centering prayer twice a day, and listening to Father Thomas talk. It was this experience that, and just hearing you, it feels like I'm back there again. Being with all of you today has felt like that again. And I don't have that at home, and I'm the one who's teaching a lot at home. And I have to remember this, Rolly, about love. Because what can get in the way for me as a head type particularly is this movement through stages of faith and understanding it really cognitively. And when I teach the women, I started women's groups in 2002. No, excuse me, 2003. I started these women's groups, and I started the groups that I was longing for. I was just longing for a community because I didn't have my community anymore. And I was longing for something where I could be with other people, and I wanted to bring to the women what I had gotten in theology. And I wanted them to know that there's a feminine face of God. And then I wanted them to kind of experience some emptiness of any construct of God at all. That for me was a real breakthrough. Because I was so aware of how my mind is so attached to the visualization of it all. And I love the metaphor of Christ knocking on the door. And so starting these groups and watching these women move them, and what I was going to do is push the river here. I was going to get them up to speed, get them out of mythic, shift them into rational, and I had a plan. It didn't work out that way. Because what I kept running into myself, and then I kept running into their own interiors. And I felt so, I was so moved by what the mythical God was doing for some of them, and there were a few women who couldn't stay in my groups as I was dismantling their construct with people like Marcus Borg or Joan Chittister or some of the feminist theologians. They needed the mythical construct. They had just lost their husbands, and they needed to know he was in heaven because it was all they knew. And that, for me, was a realization that you can't push the river here. You have to honor right where these women are.
Mm.
And those kinds of things happened again and again with these women's groups. But what's been exciting is to watch them shift. And to watch them say to something, Leslie, isn't there a book, Living Buddha, Living Christ? Is there any Buddhist books? I saw something on that, was it her name, Pema Chodron, or something like that? And to have these Catholic women asking for books from the Buddhist tradition, and learning breath meditation, or bringing them, we did Aikido as a clairsentient practice this past year, and we're this one tradition that has the incarnation, and we're the most separate from our bodies. And so for them to shift into recognizing their bodies and movement, and walking around, we bought some land since outside of Cincinnati, so they can walk around in nature and experience themselves and entertain this notion of an experience of the divine right here and amongst ourselves and out on the property. And they're all talking about walking through the world differently now. And so what I've started to realize is when I teach, and I don't call it integral Christianity, I would call it integral women, because not everybody comes from the Christian tradition in our groups. But I have to remember those three centers, because I can get so excited by ideas. And I have to remember how I felt when you just shared what you shared, so that they can have an experience of each other. And I have to hold a space, because for me now, as I watch them move through rational, kind of into this postmodern, I now want to push them along now to an integral experience. And I see their anger, and one of the things I just listening to Diane's podcast today, recognizing what it looks like is, to hold a space for somebody to just a little bit of an uncomfortable space, and can you hold it a minute longer? And that's what has been the growth edge right now in working with these women, is can I hold a minute longer of them not knowing, of them feeling uncomfortable, and also not projecting my fear onto them, and wanting them to have an experience just like mine. And that's where the self-reference can come in, and recognizing that theirs is going to be really different. So the stages have been an incredible gift, but also masculine-feminine typology. And when I heard Cynthia Bourgeot being interviewed, where it's kind of integral space, it's non-duality of no masculine and feminine, there's just kind of this emptiness. I wanted to say, but wait, because my women need the sacred feminine.
Your men need the sacred feminine.
And my men, thank you. Nice job. My men, thank you. They need the sacred feminine. They need to experience that feminine face in nature. They need to walk the property, or they need to walk a labyrinth. And it's just so missing in the tradition. And the songs and music moves me, but just hearing the language, it's almost like this every time I sit there. And so I've noticed, and I struggle sometimes with saying some of the prayers, because if I shift them into gender-neutral language, then I'm separating from myself from the community, and the communal experience. And so I struggle with that. There's an interior struggle with that. And I want to say it's resolved. I want to say I've arrived, and I want to say that it's resolved. And what I'm recognizing is that the struggle itself is the path, and it seems to be the one that I'm on. And how can I hold a space for the men and women who come through the groups if I don't hold a space for my own unknowing of what this is going to turn out like? Because I just would like to fast forward to non-duality, to unity with God right now, check that off the list, so that I don't have this anymore. So that I don't sit at Mass and listen to the language and just feel so like our voices aren't heard, and that the tradition forgets our voices. But love doesn't have a gender, and if I can remember that, and have that container, that's really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
I suppose it's up to me.
It's all resting on you now.
I've been piecing together different perspectives you have of your life as you move through it. There's only very recently, it's a question I've always had, like, well, you were saying, well, why did I not sort of do my leaving bit, get out of the tradition? And I grew up an Irish Catholic from in a very enlightened family. I would add, that was a great benefit to me. So that they weren't your typical, rather big into ideas and sense of culture and all that. But I think one of the most important figures, it's only recently I've begun to understand. I had an uncle who died at the age of 11, my mother's brother, and obviously left a big scar in her life, dying at that age. And when I was 12, I was in school. And the headmaster, the president of the school, he was beyond approach, he wasn't a figure that boys came near very much, was the man who did the funeral for my nephew. And I one day got into my head rightly that I was treated unfairly. And I went up to this man's office in a part of the school that boys didn't normally go into, knocked on his door and insisted on hearing. And it's only recently I began to realise the impact it must have had on that man. Because he buried my mother's brother. He buried him just at, and we weren't. I have a photograph of him. We looked quite alike. And anyway, he took me in, sat me down, heard my story, and said, "Yes, you've got a case." And I'd been given 3 biffs or slugs of leather. This is in Ireland in the 1960s. And he said, "We'll give you credit." Which is great. But a few years later I had a similar episode with another priest, who again I got, this wasn't to do with corporal punishment actually then, but I mean that was part of the deal, that was in Ireland and Britain, very much so. But I realised I got an unusual experience growing up. And therefore moving, and I had it then at a huge moment in my life where I knew I was called to the priesthood. I felt God naming me. I can tell you the place, what I was doing. It was Easter Sunday actually. And I decided I was going to find out where the Jesuits were in Dublin. I knew of Gardiner Street. I knew no Jesuits. I knew about their history, and I was intrigued something about their history because I had studied it in school. I studied the suppression of the Jesuits. I knew they had died and come back from the dead, and that appealed to me. I also knew that they were kind of experimenters, and my brother, a year or two later, introduced me to Teilhard de Chardin. And I remember the first time I read them, I had to stand up and walk around the place as I was reading. I found it so exciting. But over those years, I've been part of the institution, and I've been living my life within the structures. And seeing the pain of an awful lot of people, including my own family, and the distancing and the alienation and the frustration, and knowing I could not leave this, and wondering, was there something wrong with me? Was I repressed? Was I, all the sort of, was I, guilt-ridden? And the answer was yes, but, this is still my path. My brother, who introduced me to Thai, also introduced me to yoga, which was also, I used to use yoga as my form of prayer, yoga exercises, along with the Ignatian exercises, because part of Ignatius is that you position your body as you find helpful. So I said, well, that's okay, that fits here. And also I was aware too of, particularly over here in the States, there was a huge influence, particularly among Irish Jesuits and elements in the Irish Church from the States of things that were happening. And all ideas, people going over to study and all that sort of stuff. So there's always been a big sort of waves of influence, including the whole exploration of Eastern mysticism and experience and all that. And 5 years ago I found myself going to this Benedictine monastery down in New Mexico, and at the same time as Pam, and I met this character who I thought was a bit weird, And I thought she was a big new agey, freaky sort of guy. And then she was telling me what she actually did. No. Then she said she was telling me what she actually did with her life. And what she did with people broken, hurt, really rolling up her sleeves. And I realised, no, this is not what I imagined. And I suppose then she invited me over here to Deesdale, and I've been still trying to get rid of me 5 years later. But I found today, actually, as I was celebrating the Mass, I felt very, at the start, the whole weight of, you're talking about the tradition. It is, there's a burden of sin that accumulates. I've come to understand it around the Gospels. All four of the Gospels turn around a point, and it's the point when Peter recognises Jesus as the Christ or as the Holy One. And up to then it's sort of Jesus is out healing, the crowds are gathering, he's gathering his disciples, he's got the 12, and he sends them out, and they come back, and it's getting better and better and better, and Peter says, you're the Christ. And they all realise, this is the Christ. God, that's fantastic. And then he brings them apart, and the things go downhill, because their gap in their understanding. He starts saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, I'm going to be given over to death. And they're saying, no way. And then also he has the moment where they're in the road saying, who's the greatest? They're having their arguments. They have another moment where they tell the children, no, keep away. And that's very near the edge. And then there's the moment when the moment of the rich young man, where they say, well, how the hell, if you're, if the rich can't get into heaven, who can? And then there's the moment where actually he gives this teaching on divorce, which is actually where their relationship is about to fracture apart. And then they go to Jerusalem, and it does. And then things come back together again. They reassemble through the resurrection, really. And I think that's the story that happens with the whole institution and culture of Catholicism again and again. And I think we're living through that now. And I suppose I feel that and it's all around at the moment. It's all to do with within Catholicism around one way or another. The hurting points are around sexuality. I mean, there's a whole growth of awareness of justice and all that, but people are happy enough with that. But it's all around that whole area: gender, sexuality. That really the pain is, and the dying is, and I believe the resurrection is too. I believe, just the image of the crucifix is a significant one for me, because that took 1,000 years. What we call the traditional crucifix took 1,000 years before they had that dead man on the cross with the wound, which is the sign that he was dead, because they had to see that he was dead. But he's hung there for 1,000 years with that nice, polite little loincloth. And you can imagine the nice Roman soldiers say, "Where's the loincloth, lads? You've got to put the loincloth around him, But I think, now we have to take away that loincloth and reflect on, who he was. And just as when that first crucifix was put in place, people realised he actually suffered, his flesh was torn. It took 1,000 years for them to admit that. In the catacombs, there are no images of the cross. It was too shocking. It was like putting a hangman loose up. And now I think we're at this point where we're going to have to take away that loincloth and understand him as a sexual, and understand the theological implications of that, because it has to be, yes, male and female. And I think that's where we'll find our healing, around that.
There's these different points of healing. I mean, obviously, what Father Thomas said at the Integral Contemplative Christianity, which blew me away, is if you don't want to be God, you've missed the point. And that was one of those things. I said, excuse me, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I have to meditate on that for a while. That was really, really helpful, that piece. And then the other piece was this recognition that those 4 synoptic gospels were only 4 synoptic gospels. There were all of these other missing gospels that weren't used, and why were they chosen, and the political implications of why those 4 were chosen. It was really helpful to me and very healing to me to read the Gospel of Thomas, which Elaine Pagels just poured through and translated, learned Aramaic, translated it from Aramaic. And she's talking to a friend of hers who read the Gospel of Thomas, who said, if I'd have read these, I wouldn't have had to become a Buddhist. So to look at the non-dual Jesus and just do it, see the work that Cynthia Bourgeois was bringing us on the non-dual Jesus. and to really deconstruct. I know for the contemplatives the notion of deconstruction. So we're missing the point because that's exterior, but the deconstruction, that movement through rational, feels important. Because whether you're reading Marcus Borg here, or any of the Jesus Seminar, or the feminist theologians, your recognition that this isn't, okay, these four were here, that's it, the story, but you're starting to recognize that these were people's experience of the Christ. This is an interior experience. It's a movement inside. And that you can have an experience of the Christ right now. You can have an encounter right now. And so the facticity starts to slide away. But it's almost the permission for a mythic person to recognize that, to even call into question the facticity of those force and optics is useful. Because it's a portal of entry to start saying that I can have an interior experience. The authority doesn't have to be located out there. It doesn't have to be the priest who's doing the translation. The authority moves inward. I can read this story just like we look at these stories along the wall here. And I can read them and I can have an interior experience of them. And I can unpack them by myself or with my journal or with others.
There was one of the evenings at this 06 seminar, there's a moment I'll never forget. Do you remember the Brother David, Father Thomas dialogue? It's one of the evenings. So for those who don't know, we work a lot with developmental levels, and Ken Wilber has given them colors so that they're quite easy to refer to. And so if we just use altitudes, we could use spiral dynamics too, but the red altitude is a tribal, kind of warring type of altitude. And then amber beyond that is the very mythical and heaven and hell and right and wrong. Beyond that, rational orange. Beyond that, pluralistic green, and then integral teal. So just keeping in mind those colors and what each of them mean. Edwin, one of the participants, asked very, very hopefully of Father Thomas and Brother David, these two pioneers, absolute pioneers in the church in this day and age. And he just asked very hopefully, well, where are the cardinals at developmentally? Like what level are they at? So Father Thomas, it's a wonderful sense of humor, just kind of scratches his head and says, well, as far as I can tell, they're mostly red.
So for those of you who aren't Catholics, the cardinals wear red.
Yeah, so and it was a beautiful play on words that Father Thomas did, saying that they're not where we wish they were. And then Brother David, in just a few sentences, really tied together this paradox that I have. How can I remain in the church when I disagree with so many teachings? You know, we're speaking that Mary Magdalene, in all the Gospels, was the first to see Christ. And in each case, Christ says, don't cling to me, but go tell my brethren that I've risen. So she goes and tells them. So she's the apostle to the apostles, but she's not an apostle. She can't be an apostle, but she's the apostle to the apostles. So starting with there's so many things I disagree with, but yet it seems I need to remain, because what will I do from the outside? How could I ever have any impact if I was to stomp out and brush the dust off my feet? So Brother David tied those together for me in these two sentences. He said, there's a flock of 1 billion in the Catholic Church, and it's heavy. And the Church is the largest provider of healthcare in the world, largest provider of education in the world. The flock is heavy, and they do a good job of it. But we can't expect the Vatican to lead us, he said,
Yes.
Which is an astounding statement, which meant both remain, do all you can from the position that you're in, and also walk your path and walk it to its limit, even if you walk alone.
Well, in El Salvador and a lot of Latin America, they have a lot of faith-based communities because there aren't priests down there. And so I went down to, my daughter lives in El Salvador, and I went down, and they had a celebration of and they didn't call it the Mass, but it was a celebration of the Mass, and a woman was leading it. And the Eucharist was Oreos. Oreo cookies. Yeah. And the way they would read Scripture And this was really moving because they would read something from Scripture, and then the people from the community, and Laura said when we were going and we were going to be late, and I was always very timely for church, and so we were like a half an hour late, 40 minutes late, and she said, "No, Mom, don't worry, it goes on for a few hours." Because what they do is all of the people tell their own experience of the Scripture reading, and almost all of them relate it to the war and the massacres of their communities and the murder of Archbishop Romero as he was saying Mass on the altar. And all of them talk. One of the most moving experiences I ever had was on Good Friday. My husband is not Catholic, and my son doesn't practice Catholicism. And we were all in there, and my daughter brought us into this community, and they were all playing homemade instruments. And I didn't understand a lot of what they were saying because I don't speak Spanish. But as they're talking, the passion with which they say, "Christos, you know us, you know suffering, you are like us, you know suffering." And you could feel the emotion in the room, and they would sing the song, and Dave said the only song the one word he would understand, 2 words he understood was Christos and Romero. Everything was, Romero was anything, because Romero understood our suffering too. And he was placed in El Salvador, and people saw him as a pawn for the military dictatorship there, because he had really tried to build some sense of peace in this community, and really kind of playing under the radar. He's supposedly a 6, playing under the radar. And when one of his friends was murdered, and he started to speak out, and the more he spoke out, the more he could just see what was happening to the people there. And that, to me, when I was in grad school and I was getting all of this deconstruction, was models, which is so huge, is modeling the importance of having models, that people can see that, are you practicing love? And for him, it just having this tenuous balance between the people whom he served and this military dictatorship, and what do I do? And then finally falling on the side of love and saying these people are the Christ. We have to be a voice for the people. And to go down there and be in the Rose Garden where the nuns and the Jesuits were murdered, and to be at the site of all of that, you recognize this path of love. And why, and this is a very amber, which is the mythical, Salvadorans are very amber Christians. And you can see how important amber Christianity is down there. My daughter going down there was really helpful, this kind of postmodern, very green Christian going down there. And seeing the evangelicals who come in with amber mindset, and seeing the work that they do. And just saying, Mom, you just kind of have to hold a space for all of this. And I'm really starting to understand what integral looks like when it's played out in a place like this. Because she was resistant. She's real green, and she's a little bit resistant to this hierarchical stuff that you're doing with integral. But she can now just to see it played out down there. And that's what I just find. So when it becomes an experience, whether it be integral, whether it be I taking Diane's integral Zen class, I was taking it during a time where somebody was dying, and when it becomes an experience, then it's anchored inside of you, and you have less of the resistance, because you just recognize that that's just the way it is, and it's a part of it. It's part of the holding the tension. That's what you were talking about today, just in the state of the world. It's always holding the tension, no matter where we are.
It's one of the things as you're talking about the different understanding where different people are at the levels, and yet within cultures there's transitions going on. And I'd be conscious within my own Jesuit culture. There's we're in transition, and there is, I think we were talking about this earlier, the question of death and resurrection. It's around those moments that even you're talking about the knocking, something I think so it's interesting. Like at one level, I suppose that the closer it comes home to you and your culture, you know, and the transition that your culture is passing in, that you are brought with it. You know, you can go to El Salvador and see these people at the mythical level, but if you were, you know, within the States, there are people who are, you know, not in the integral level, and they probably you want to tear your hair out. You know, I know. I see it in Ireland. I mean, you know, it's very similar to some of the cultures there. But how? I suppose how the individual lives out, caught within that transition. How the individual lives is an important thing.
Well, isn't this the beauty of the work you're doing with integral contemplative Christianity? If you don't have the interior practice, that's it. That's the Rosetta Stone right there. That's what sustains you through the shifts of stages.
You know, a couple of things I wanted to say. One of the beautiful things about integral is that one of my greatest, most recent spiritual teachers, our Christian teacher, has been a rabbi, which is not strange. Jesus was also called a rabbi, but it's been Rabbi Mark Goffney, and for all his, you know, those of you who know him, for all his brilliance, he just gets this radical love, you know, just loves. He's just, you know, so I'm learning about this thing that you're talking about. My original spiritual awakening was God is love. Oh my God, I just wanted to tell my parents, you know, we don't have to do Vietnam. We can love each other. It was like, you know, 11 years old, like, okay, what did, you know, did we leave the gas on in the kitchen or something? But meeting Mark and becoming his friend, it just really has informed my, you know, I can just let it rip, you know. I mean, I'm Cancer, and astrologically and reserved and stuff like that. I've become more loving, which is so gorgeous, you know. And in my own interior heart, the historical woundings and struggles between Christianity and Judaism have really dissipated and broke down, and I just see it, same family, same God, same Spirit, same love, same scriptures even. It's been very gorgeous. And the second part is because, you know, I've been working with integral recovery, and the map, of course, is the aqua map. We haven't even talked about that. That's a whole other conversation, how we can apply aqua to looking at Christianity and just making it more beautiful and up-to-date and gorgeous and evolutionary. But is the idea of an integral life practice. And, you know, when I'm working with my students, when we go to the gym, you know, before we start doing our strength training, we sit for a moment and dedicate it to our highest good, whatever that might be. So that infuses the workout with a passion, and not just, you know, narcissistic, you know, I want to have great pecs and, you know, blah blah blah, all this stuff. But there's a real sense of it, and in my own life, because I was such a wreck, the integral life practice has completely transformed my life and opened me up. And at this point, I really see that being faithful to those practices, as imperfect as my practices are, but just sticking with it, is really my give back, you know, to God, and it becomes very sacramental, you know. And I was sitting on just a huge load of darkness and suffering and wounds that I was aware of, you know. A lot of it I was aware of, not all of it, but a lot of it I was aware of intellectually, but didn't get there. And as I started to sit more and practice more and sit in that space, I had to encounter all this pain. And it's interesting that the icon right behind you, Rolly, is that comes from the monastery on Mount Sinai, which is, I think, maybe the oldest continually functioning monastery in the world, Christian monastery in the world. And when I was at Christ in the Desert, where I showed up at the end of the month long, and I saw this icon. And I was just attracted to it and brought it home, and it's next to my bed now. And so when I was doing my meditation in the morning, I'm with this 9 months of just intense, deep pain and shadow stuff. And sometimes I would just, like, the pain would become so overwhelming that the boundaries of my ego couldn't hold it. I was about to say, fuck it, can't do it. And I'd look over and I'd see the face of Christ right there. And this aspect of Christ that's in this picture is someone who's been there, been through it and back. And it was just this look of love, but not letting me off the hook in any sense. And I found that where my second person perspective began to reemerge, my relationship with God as other, intimate other, became in my deep suffering and this pain, and at these points where, God, I can't take it anymore. I'm so beyond what I can handle. And then this, all I can say is grace, you know. Beautiful, beautiful sense of grace that the Christian tradition infuses into practice that allowed me to stay with it, and so that and the integral model as it's been developing and as Ken's taught us, the beyond the map, beyond the psychoactive, Ken says Aquamap is psychoactive. It changes you actually to look at life this way, but it's the intense dedication to practice, and practice the body, mind, heart, and soul that we've delineated beautifully in ILP and integral transformative practice or recovery practice as a sacramental give back to God, not as a narcissistic, I just want to get smarter and better and cuter and, you know, and more successful, rah, 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 but it's really, you know, you're preparing yourself to be a vessel of God, you know, and St. Francis prayed, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And as a small soul, as an individual human being in the world, the greatest, I think, experience can be happen is when you really feel that you're doing that. You're right in the center, as close as you can get, with all your screw up and foibles, to the center of God's will, and you're being that vessel. When we were teaching earlier about the Enneagram, I was just sitting, and this woman is right in the center of her life. And teaching us, and by doing the practices sacramentally, holy, with discipline and grace. There's an old prayer I heard somewhere, or a poem, a Christian poem, and it says, you know, ready to go, ready to stay, ready my place to fill, ready for service, small or great, ready to do God's will. You know, maybe we're not all called to be great or write great books or do great things or make great contributions. Who knows what is really going on in God's mind? But the capacity to continually practice and work on this finite vessel that we've been given, and unite it with our deep soul, which is where the finite and the infinite connect inside of us, is a tremendously evolutionary, revolutionary, healing, and sacred contribution that I think integral theory is making to the field of Christianity, and it thrills me.
Can I kind of strike a slightly jarring note? And as you're talking about integral Christianity, I just realised I've kind of come into this from another stream, if you like. Mm-hmm. I can see a lot of parallels in what you're saying. And I suppose what I'm saying is there are things going on out there that are in sync. A lot of things actually in sync. Different movements around. And I think it's related to what you're talking about, you know, the Vatican doesn't lead. It doesn't actually. I mean, it never has. You know, and that's... and it's... Every movement has its language, its in language. I mean, I could come out with a whole lot of Jesuit in language.
Sure.
And there's always... yeah, I'm just saying that. Just put that out there.
Well, and it doesn't seem to be the Vatican's job to lead on this. It's, again, back to faith-based communities, small communities of people like this. I think of Helen Palmer starting all of her teaching was in a room like this. Mm-hmm. And it's just, what that does, too, is to use an overused word, is it empowers us to, that the authority is no longer out there, to move this authority inside and to develop a spiritual practice inside of ourselves.
But I suppose the point I was sort of bringing up was how, and there was an issue that you brought up earlier in your previous talk today about, you know, somebody saying to you, you don't understand it all. You know, you can't understand it all. And I think there are streams moving, which, you know, I mean, the integral theory, as I've been reading about it and exploring it and talking with you over the years about it, is very rich. And yet there's something beyond, I suppose. Yeah. I'm just thinking of an experience I had with a men's group where I had to go into that group. I just got it. the whole sort of post-church thing, you know, in Ireland. And I was the only one, well, there was one other, but I realised I had to kind of allow my faith to kind of go. You know, that's what faith is, you let go. and see what came back. And I think there's even in all kinds of the way we say take a theory, which is what it is. There's, I suppose, the via negativa, the way that it's not this, it's not that, it's this and it's more, and it's always tripping up, I suppose.
I love your point about the body, and your point about it being and actually the incarnational tradition, and for being the incarnational tradition, how much is neglected the body. It's just sort of ironic. I mean, incarnation is beautiful. It's that God becomes human so that we might become God. Or Meister Eckhart says we are to become heaven so that God can find a place here. It's amazing. So I love the point that you made. I have a question for the folks here. How many would say they're Christians, or at least have a Christian background of some sort?
Background?
Yeah. 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 The one thing I found really helpful is to try to look with new eyes, or to try to take new perspectives on those old scriptures, or on the tradition. And speaking of feminism, we've been reading the Gnostic Gospels. So if you're somewhat familiar with the Bible, reading the Gnostic Gospels is a real wild ride. And there's one in particular that I'd love if you looked at. It's the Book of Thunder. Now, whereas almost all the books are, authorship is said to be male, this book is almost certainly written by a woman. But it's in the voice of a woman at the very least, and it's amazing. It's
So for those of you who, I don't know if you're familiar, then Gnostics is knowing, so it's a direct knowing of God. And the Gnostic Gospels really are, it's what, 1945, there were scrolls found in the Nag Hammadi Desert in Egypt, and by a boy. And it was a whole, and they've been authenticated, and they were written prior to the Synoptic Gospels, which are the ones in the Bible now, the 4 Synoptic Gospels. And so when you read them now, it's such a different experience, because you see a much more of a Jesus, a non-dual Jesus. And it's really interesting, and I don't know if all of you, I don't know if you, Edmund, as much, but I know that for people I know who've kind of walked away, and you can go work with another tradition, and that's what I found so useful about moving into the postmodern, whether it be a yogic practice, as you've been doing, or a Zen practice. You start to realize how other traditions inform your own path. And so there's certain ones of us who sometimes want to leave the tradition, but in your spiritual practice, you keep having images from your own tradition. And that's what I kept running into, was I kept having images of my own tradition, or I'll go in today and see the Stations of the Cross, and I just feel this movement. And so it's now, can I take those images from my tradition, because there's for the Zen tradition, it makes so much sense, and it's been so useful for spiritual practice. But there's this second person component for some reason I just have this longing for, that is there in my tradition. And so it's really playing with that. That's what I have found so awesome about the integral map, is recognizing that inner experience, my inner practice. And I do centering prayer, and I do the meditation Diane was teaching as an integral Zen. So I'm doing them both, because it's like one helps me really with this focus that as a 7 is so important to me, and the other is just this path of love, of relationality, and then I'm finding that each informs the other.
I had an experience very powerful along exactly those lines. So in Buddhist meditation, one of the most profound forms is called Tonglen. And I've learned this from Diane. One of her teachers, Trungpa Rinpoche, when asked near the end of his life, he's kind of a wild character, and near the end of his life he was asked, how does he meditate? And his answer was, Tonglen, baby. So that's toward the end of his life. That was his soul.
Tongue-in, baby.
That was his soul practice.
He also said that when you're meditating, your focus on the breath should be on the out breath, in the same way that when you sit down on a couch at the end of the day and you open a beer, and you kind of go. Same
So-
teacher.
Which makes him one of the patron saints of ventricle recovery.
So how this Tonglen prayer, it's very beautiful. This meditation works is that you breathe in suffering and you breathe out compassion. And usually you'll start with maybe even just one person you know who's suffering. Breathe in their suffering and breathe out compassion on them, and then slowly expand the sphere until it's the whole universe or all sentient beings. And you're breathing in all the suffering of the universe and breathing out all the compassion of the divine on them. And we're vessels who can do that. So I'd learned about this form of meditation. It became very powerful for me. And then on Good Friday one year, listening to the gospel, and I heard this gospel 40, 50 times, and just listened really carefully with some exposure to the East. And the last line in the Gospel of John, depending on various translations, the last line in Jesus' life, not the last thing he says, but the very last sentence about his life on earth is, "And Jesus breathed his last." And I realized he was doing Tonglen on the cross. And it was this one session for all of time, where with every breath, as he slowly died, he was breathing in all the suffering of the world and breathing out compassion until Jesus breathed his last. And then that became a practice for me, which beautifully informed by Integral, and it's that we can stand by the cross, and our heart is the Sacred Heart. There's no difference. It's not that his is the Sacred Heart and we have some replica of it. That's the heart of the universe, and our heart is one with the heart of Christ, so we can stand by the cross and with Christ breathe in all the suffering of the world and breathe out all the compassion of God. And so it became a new practice for me because of the gifts of the East and just
Yes.
listening with new ears.
Sally Kempton did a meditation with us at Integral, or at JFKU on the heart. Do you remember that, Rochelle? And so went back home and was doing that all the time because it was just a really powerful meditation. She's from. What struck me as I was doing the practice, just started having these images of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and that's. So you start to see how your tradition just kind of keeps returning to you. And with the interior practice, you start to recognize that these are all different expressions of being. And so for I know from my own experience, it's just not feeling as attached to, and not getting as worked up around the doctrinal stuff. It can happen. It still happens. And there's times when, when some edict comes out, like the investigation of the nuns right now got me, had to do some spiritual practice around that because the nuns are very progressive. And David Reardon, in fact, came up to me and said, when he was talking to Father Thomas, saying, who do we go to for future Christianity? Who are the people that are really doing some of this? And he said, find the women. And a lot of these nuns, and he says, finding these 80-year-old nuns, rocking out and doing some of this more progressive, whether it be yoga or learning, teaching Zen, or the Enneagram is considered progressive. Energy work, a lot of energy work. A lot of nuns are doing energy work. And so when I find they're being investigated, it's just, again, it's that, forgive them and know not what they do is one piece, and then dealing with my own anger around what has happened to the tradition as another piece.
One of the things that, as I've been getting familiar with the integral thing, the first, second, third, 1, 2, 3, sheds light, I suppose, on some things for me. And one of the things, only this afternoon in a conversation with Pam, she was mentioning how the Jesuit tradition, the whole thing of conversation with Jesus is very central to it. And I suddenly realised, no, we have a one, actually. And there's a saying of St. Ignatius, it's not much knowledge that satisfies the soul, but a deep and intimate relish of the truth. And the heart of Jesus has been a very central thing in our tradition. And yet, over the past 40 years, we've almost dumped it. It's extraordinary. And yet someone like Tyler the Chardin was very, but it is, I think, getting within and being, I think the joy, I suppose the point I was making when, in striking my note there past, is that we need the different languages, actually.
Yeah,
we need to kind of look over at one another and say, yeah, well, yeah. And that keeps us kind of from owning anything.
Yes.
That's the thing,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
There's
the
a-
true vow of poverty, or another take on poverty. You know,
Yeah.
we don't own ours as.
the poor in spirit.
So I don't know, but it's because I'm so curious where people are.
Yeah, I was about to
Yeah,
do that
just
move.
So,
So
yeah,
thank
so
you.
curious about. Just wondering where people are on this notion of an integral Christianity, because the expression, there's 70% of Christians are mythic and below in terms of stages. And so it's not always expressed in a way that people are drawn to. And a lot of times it is. A lot of times,
Yes.
obviously, a lot of times it
Yeah.
is. Just wondering.
Yeah, there are questions, comments.
I guess I have a just thing that's just coming up for me that I'm trying to pay attention to inside of myself. I grew up Baptist, Southern Baptist, so I'm in the last couple of years have been learning about Catholicism and through different practices as well. And I'll be honest, I've been listening to all of this, and the whole time I've been pushing down this thing inside of me, being like, no one's going to get this where I come from. No one is going to see this, and it's a judgment that's coming out of me based on the way I was raised. And I, too, walked away from that faith in anger and judgment, and felt wronged. And I talked to Edmund a little bit about this. It's like, it turned me away when I was very young and when I was searching for faith. And it's taken me 11 years to get to the point that I can say that I have faith developing inside of myself now. And with that transition, I'm finding peace with Christianity again and finding people that I can speak to about it. I guess the question that I might have for all of you that comes out of this conversation is, when you see integral, which I'm familiar with from John and his teachings over the last 5 years, when you see it start to integrate into the different aspects of Christianity and other religions as well, how do you see it progressing? How do you see it being accepted by not only Catholics, but Baptists, Southern Baptists, the Snake Dancers of West Virginia, like all of these religions? Like, how do you see it accepted? Where's it going to go?
One of the things that strikes me as you're talking is that to find the center of faith in yourself is the place from which you can see, and I think just in my conversations with John and over the last few years, that the idea of people being in different stages of development is a very helpful one. But really, how can we tell? How can you were talking to me earlier about wanting to get them up.
Move them along.
I would say, like, as a pastor, it's a very helpful thing to, that insight. People being, it's kind of common sense too, but to have a kind of a framework, yeah, you can't, force people to up the ladder, and also you can't patronise people. So there's a double bind there, and I think it goes back to a question of the holy. The holiness is found everywhere. You know, people at sort of the mythic level, if you like. I'm still not used to the language, but I kind of who are holy, and you get people, you just see God shining through them, and it's nothing to do with being at this or that level. That's why it makes me curious as to what, I don't know the answer to this, but what makes the intimate level higher in some ways. I think I've no sense that it is, that you evolve through, I can see that, but I mean, in terms of holiness, it doesn't actually make any difference. And yet in terms of personal call, I suppose it does. That's something like that. But I think, you know, it is a question of providence. I'm not trying to, you know, cop out here, but I think there is that element there. There's an extraordinary love at work.
Can I just offer something to support what you're saying in the way Ram Dass answered the same question related to this? He had a student who was Jewish but who was studying Buddhism, and of course his Jewish parents were really upset about this. So Ram Dass said to this Jewish boy, you know, he said, how's your mother doing with your Buddhism? And she said, she hates my Buddhism, but she loves when I'm the Buddha. It's the same way of saying to Jesus.
St. Francis said, preach the gospel if necessary, use words.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there's a wonderful teacher named Father B. Griffiths. Anybody heard of him?
Amen.
So he's one of the first Christians who really went east, and he formed an ashram in India, and he said we're going to. It was amazing. It was the community of being knowledge and bliss, Satichananda, and he said we are going to live and follow in the footsteps of Christ, but we're going to do it in a Hindu way. We're going to do it in a way that's not westernized at all. And for scriptures, they read the Vedas, you know, they read the sutras, and they would usually have a gospel in there. But it was an amazing, beautiful experiment in some sense, but really the way forward, I think. And I actually have a third-hand communication from Father B. Griffiths, which is amazing. He died in '94, but this has become very special to me. In a dream, somebody at Snowmass, Father Thomas's monastery, spoke with Father Bede, and Father Bede gave him a formula to follow, words to live by. And the formula was this, and it's very similar to the Vedanta formula of the world is illusory, Brahman alone is real, the Absolute alone is real, the world is Brahman. Sort of a three-stage unfolding of a spiritual path.
Say that again?
Yeah, the world is illusory,
Yeah.
Brahman alone is real, the world is Brahman. So that's the very traditional formulation in the East, but the one that Father Bede said to this person at Snowmass in a dream was, there is an other, become the other, there is no other. It's a really lovely sort of second person journey. But I bring him up because he wrote something that I read maybe 15, 20 years ago that was really meaningful to me, and he was talking about the creed. So I believe in God the Father Almighty, etc. And he said, don't you see, the creed is a pointing out instruction. You can't imagine that these words in English and originally in Latin are somehow capturing the truth for all time. They can't. Words can't capture the mystery. So the words are pointing to something beyond the words. It's like the finger and the moon and the Zen slap and all that. But so I think that hopefully we can come up with ways to work in exactly the scriptures and speak in the way that you would have in a Southern Baptist homily or sermon, but with words that are really carefully chosen, that are pointing beyond maybe where the tradition is landing at that point. So maybe that we can, in a sense, write or rewrite the Gospels, or at least choose very skillfully. And Ken has talked about a universal catechism. So a version of the Gospels that really makes sense at each level, but also reaches you right here, not right here, but just right at your edge, and helps to point to a beyond.
Just a writer I read earlier this year. I do read and talk about other than Jesuits sometimes, but this guy is a man called Jacques Dupuy, a French Jesuit, who wrote a book called Towards the Christian Theology of Religious Pluralism. And his basic thesis is we cannot come to know Christ fully until we have come to experience all the different religions of the world. And this book actually has been in and out of the Vatican Mill. So I mean, this is actually it's interesting. It survived a trial about its Catholic unorthodoxy. So it said, no, this is Orthodox Catholicism. But this is, and it talks about the basic covenant of God with the world and with humanity is the covenant of Noah. After the flood, God said, I will never destroy the world again. I promise that. And this is the basic covenant. There's 3 covenants, not 2. And the 3rd covenant includes all the other religions, including their scripture. He's talking about that the scripture is revelatory in some way.
Yes, God reveals God's self through other traditions and other scriptures. There's something else that really it just strikes me what you're experiencing, because just knowing we talked a little bit about the Enneagram after the talk today, and around some issues around authority that can come up for 6s and 7s. And a lot of it really is, it's just working your own edge, and working the pain, working whatever it is, or going back to your family and experiencing your family. And what my experience has been is there's really an energetic component, is that people can experience if I'm pushing the river and being patronizing in some way or trying to push in some way, and people can experience if I'm really present to them. And I had this really come home to me one time. I was doing a meditation, and I just was kind of feeling really anti-authoritarian. It was just, why do I have to do this? And then I realized it was because I was teaching a class and I had assigned the meditation. And I was rebelling against myself. And so then I realized that it's just this construct. And it's really very 7ish. Don't boss me around. Don't tell me what to do. And guess what? That's what I hit. And I hit it wherever I go, whatever tradition I'm in, whether it's a religious tradition or it's at work. I'm going to run into that child, sticking her hand, don't boss me around. And when sometimes it's the deep bow of myself prostrate on the ground, that's exactly what I need. So it's kind of working that as the edge, and just sitting with that. And some of the pain around it, of seeing your family and you in this place of separation. And we discuss this all the time in the integral community, in our little sangha of, just people who came from these evangelical homes or something like that and go back in.
Well, one of the nice things about the AA tradition, and I probably got the quote wrong, but it's we don't proselytize, it's through attraction, and if what we're doing is gorgeous or good enough to be attractive in a good way, not in a bad way. There's ways to attract to evil and to suffering and all kinds of things, but that's what we have to work, that's what we have to work with. And it really goes back, the heart of the Christian mystery, in my little 11-year-old self, and what you keep bringing up, Lily, is love. And how do you manifest that love? How do you manifest it wisely, and not idiot love? Going through green and stuff, we really learned, okay, there's compassion and there's idiot compassion. And so, for example, with my family, Ken's always saying, how do you know if you're enlightened? Go home for the holidays and see what happens there. But one of the things with my parents and my family is, as they've grown older, oh my God, they just become make Limbaugh look like a liberal, it's craziness. And I know there's no rational arguments or anything that I can do with that particular one, and they basically know where I stand, I think. And the other day I was on the phone and I was really tired, and I just got back from Boulder and all this stuff, and my mom, just said, I don't know, said some really right-wing thing, and just kind of pissed me off, and I said, all right, whatever it was, and I backed off, and she was like, oh. And it's like, and I'm going, I'm going to be with my family in a couple of weeks, and I know they're going to bait me in some points and everything. And a few years ago, oh my God, toe to toe, till the cows come home, and now it's just not important anymore. I love them. I don't want to hurt that love, and I'm just going to love them. I don't give a damn, So, So how do we work with these different levels? It's just through love, and not goofy-eyed love or stupid love, but a wise love, a mature love, and I'm still working that one out. But it seems the mystery there is the attraction of love, and or in recovery work, we say, well, you better be working on yourself and get your stuff together, because, the addicts, they have this, you can't bullshit a bullshitter, they can tell if you're for real or not, and they'll see it, and if it's not, there's not a core there, they'll just, screw you and go on, which is good.
I think too, you need space actually to talk about. I'm just thinking of my own family, who would be alienated from the church, and something happened with one of my sisters recently, and I really felt very pained and hurt for something she said. And she basically said that Catholicism is anathema to her. You see, and I remember just talking to someone, another Jesuit. He said, "I can understand that." And it was a great healing thing. But I think to be able to talk about that pain in a place where it's safe to talk about the pain is very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, to listen deeply is great. I love one of the things I love about the Quaker tradition is, if at the end of a meeting, we went to the Berkeley meeting, and they would say, if anybody wants to know more about Quakerism, there's person over here, and they were called a listener. They were never called a talker, So they would come and they would just listen. How gorgeous is that, So. Man, any other? Does that help at all?
It does. It brings up a clarifying question that I had inside of me. Just, if you had to define Jesus using integral, how would you do that? Just as the foundation of the Christian faith, how would you define Jesus?
The theology around Jesus is really lovely, and it's that this person was fully human and fully divine. And that's just a beautiful formulation, because if you go sort of one side or the other, then you lose the incarnation of it. The miracle is that God became human. But it's not that God became one human person, it's that God took on human nature, meaning God took and holds all of us. So for me, Jesus Christ is the person who first looked all the way up, the human being who first looked all the way up, and there was no ceiling to his sight, and he saw Christ and knew himself to be Christ. But then he said, just do as I have done, and he said, I'm the way, follow these footsteps. So that tells me that the invitation is for each of us to realize there's no ceiling and to look all the way up and to see who is Christ as John, or who is John as Christ,
Yes, absolutely.
Or Edmund as Christ, Christ as Edmund. That's the question for each of us, and I think that from Integral, that's the invitation, is that for each of us to realize that our true self is Christ, and then to walk as Christ would, but not 2,000 years ago with bare feet and robe, to walk exactly as you would, to walk as Christ would in your case, because that's exactly who you are. And just to do the best you can every day. And when I get out of bed, you normally have bare feet, and just that bare foot on the ground, and that's the first step in humility, and that's all you can do is put that foot down and the other foot down, and walk as best you can as Christ would in your case, because that's what's happening. There's a line from Micah, which is a pretty obscure book in the Old Testament, but I just love this line, because when it gets complicated for me, it makes it very, very simple. This the Lord God asks of you, and only this, to act justly, love tenderly, walk humbly with your God. Act justly, love tenderly, walk humbly with your God, and that's all that any of us are asked.
I went to this integral Christian thing in Boulder. It was a couple of years ago, I think, and I went there intuitively knowing that I had some stuff to heal around Christianity. I went there, and we were at some monastery outside of up in the mountains. I don't even know where it was, and I was struggling. I was doing this 3-through-1 thing, and I got into this one part. I was like, "What in the hell did they do to my Lord?" I was just feeling, the empty tomb. What did they do to Jesus? Oh my God! things that we've done in the name of Christ, you know, the slaughter, the abuse, the hatred, the war. It was like this grief. And then in this moment of revelation, I became Christ. I was just loving and enlightened, just radiant being. And not only me, but everybody in the room was too. And I saw it. Oh my God, the resolution of the Christian mystery is Christ. And it just, everything just lit up, and just tears of gratitude and humility just penetrated me. And it's great mystery. And
so it's an experience. It's an experience, and so because it's an experience, then the way I see integral really informing the experience is that there's a movement and perspective taking. So as you move along, there's, you know, just being here this weekend, there's perspectives that are now presenced in reality for me. They were already there before, but now they're presenced in my consciousness. And so the notion of the Christ moving, you know, integrally, and that might be useful too in understanding people at the mythic level, that there's perspectives they can't take because they haven't been revealed to them yet. They're just not there. And so that's not saying that the love coming through isn't the love of the Christ. Or the love of you know, the consciousness of the other traditions. There's just a limited perspective. It's an experience.
And everybody has the right to be where they're at. That's hugely important.
yeah.
The mistake that we can make early on.
Well, I was quite fascinated when you turned to your people on your left and said there's Christ in all of us, and left out our friend here. And I wondered if you all see Christ still as a male.
No, not remotely.
Yeah.
Did you feel that?
No, but just I've had some experiences of Rolly, and my guess is he would. So I think it was probably the interest of time.
In fact, what I would have really liked to have done is to have done that with everybody in the room. That's what I would have really loved to have done if I had the time, because that's what I'm beginning to see. What you mentioned is that, you know it or not, Christ is, to me, the true self of all of us. And so, no, if I had more time, I would.
But I do get angry when I see that. And I feel it's something that I experienced in convent school a lot. And it infuriates me that we could be talking about love and all these grand ideas, but in fact, you know, there are many of us who are left out of the equation. Even though you don't mean it, you have to become conscious of it and be held to the fire on it.
Yeah.
It's morally correct that everybody be included, I think.
Yeah, that's.
And good intentions really
Sure.
can be very unimportant.
Yeah. Well, let me say who is Christ is Leslie. It's a beautiful inquiry, and I mean, in our session this morning, it was just breathtakingly clear to me, just watching you teach the way you did. And who's Christ is Anna? That's for me the inquiry for every person. There's another scripture which amazes me, because again, we've heard it so many times and we never really hear it, but it's that we should love our neighbor as ourself. And so you hear that, and that means I should be nice to everybody. But if you really listen to that sentence, love your neighbor as yourself, not as much, but as yourself. That's what was said. And that's such a non-dual
They are
saying.
you.
They are you, and you are them.
And just that, and integral too, and just the feminist understanding too of God, it is all of a sudden I have this love affair with animals. And I was always I was never raised with animals. My mother was really annoyed by animals. They were smelly and dirty. And just the animals, and I drove through the canyon today, that there's nowhere that God is not. that she is. She permeates just
Mm-hmm.
everything.
Yeah, thank you for your point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think it goes back also to civil rights. I think it's something that, you know, Tutu talks about in deep listening. You know, that if we're really truly listening deeply, we are generous in our thinking. And I just wonder sometimes when I hear these kinds of conversations, if we can take them and be with them in our daily lives.
Sometimes.
And sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't. But that is the challenge. Otherwise, they become slightly
Absolutely.
masturbatory.
One of the things, I don't know whether this is speak to,
No, I just never heard that's true.
just, the resurrection of Jesus, I think, is something I've had, my understanding of it has been disturbed in a good sense recently. And I have this thing of Jesus, the tomb, he's there, he's dead, gets up, sort of wipes himself down and goes to meet everybody. And I believe the resurrection only happens in the encounters that, the tomb is empty, that's evidence. But they haven't met him. The resurrection is when people respond to him, and I think is now. Our responding now, our recognition of now, is the resurrected Jesus, and is his body. I mean, the thing you're talking about, him being human and divine, but also we are our bodies, but our body is Christ. As we kind of come into contact with the resurrected Jesus, as the risen Jesus, we are the body of Christ. That's it. We are the body of Christ. And in our flesh and blood, we are him, our God, Christ is not just male. Jesus was man, but he was Jesus Christ. And there's something about the resurrection that speaks to that.
I have to think about that. That's a big idea. I mean, not that Christ isn't in all of us, but that how you form it from the empty tomb. I don't quite get it, I guess.
Well, I think his risen life is his encounter with those who are drawn to him. That's his risen life.
Okay.
An encounter in the flesh in some way. In other words, you at some stage heard of Jesus, and you pinned it with some experience. It has to be both, it has to be inner and external. And this is his risen life, or the risen life of Christ. I shouldn't even say his risen life anymore. The cosmic Christ.
There's a lot right now too to really get with that Teilhard, or the work Michael Dowd is doing around emergent or evolutionary Christianity. There's a lot out there where that's really useful, that I have found really useful, in just uncovering this kind of evolutionary understanding of the Christ or of God, that's too dense to go into right now, but can be useful in some of those questions. I can
Because
just
some
give
of
you
the
some
holiest
resources.
people I've ever witnessed were last year in Rwanda, and they were not educated, and they were not. And it went right to your point that you were describing. That inner, you know it when you see it.
Yeah, there's this assumption that someone's Buddha nature has to be named Buddha nature, or Christ within has to be named Christ within. My husband doesn't practice any tradition, and I see the Buddha nature in him every day.
I have a question. I'm interested in this phrase, I am that I am, but don't feel like I really understand that, so I'm interested if anybody can speak to what that means.
That was when Christ looked up and didn't see a ceiling.
Didn't see what?
A ceiling.
There's also the story of Moses, and it was a story of emergence from slavery. that he recognised when he was on the run, his people were enslaved. He was on the margins, and that's when I am who I am first spoke, in history in a way, at least in the salvation, the Judeo-Christian salvation history. I think there's something about actually having the courage to go and meet people who are suffering in a way that you're not suffering. This is just going off the top of my head. That is an encounter. I know certainly that's been my experience of life. I've encountered God when I've had the courage to go, and the experience, for instance, of people in Dublin's inner city dealing with the whole drugs problem. I can think of a particular moment when they needed courage, and I was there. I just saw it, facilitated to some extent, but and that's when I could say it was like a Baroque ceiling, the clouds opening up, and that it really you had to make sense of those lush Baroque ceilings. You had to not be cliches, This was in a grimy community hall in central Dublin. We don't have those sort of things there, and I could feel this, the clouds opening up and the sun coming down. And it was people just calling out the names of drug dealers who were intimidating the whole community.
Courage.
That was I am. Well, true. I think that's why it's important about Christianity to move towards suffering. Actually,
yes,
the sort of thing you were talking about.
Yes, that's. That's really, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's such a second-person, heartfelt kind of perspective, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's so much experience, because mine was so much more conceptual, my response to that, because the Buddhist notion of suchness is what really helped me with the notion of I amness, because it's something that that can't be named. There's an I amness, and that first person of God, first, second, third, the I amness. That we want to, that the tendency, the desire is to put concepts and names on it. And when Moses, in the midst of Moses going up the mountain, was asking God, who should I say that I saw? It's that I am. And that notion of I amness inside of ourselves.
There's a Leonard Cohen song which is really lovely, and it's called "Who by Fire." And you might look it up, it's really good, but it goes, who by fire, who in the water, who in the desert, who in the storm, whom shall I say is calling, and then each verse goes, but they get more and more modern, so it's who by heroin, who by, and in the end it's every person, and every person in the situation that they're in, and then whom shall I say is calling, which is what Moses said, and it just points to that original revelation of Yahweh to the Jewish people, but then that we're all called, and we all have the divine within. So it's lovely.
Yes, and it's that encounter with suffering, or someone who just, and sometimes it's not. And suffering doesn't always imply going into the drug-addicted neighborhoods of Dublin or in El Salvador. I mean, I see a lot of suffering in the women. The groups that I facilitate, and they may come from affluence. It's just some sort of encounter with someone in pain. For me personally, it's often where I see I amness.
One thing I've got a comment I want to make is, probably for the last 15 years or so, I've just had a lot more appreciation for Catholicism, my faith. And part of it is, when I look at, studying Qigong or Buddhism or different things, they're not mine. They don't come out of the roots of my psyche and my family. And there's something really beautiful about touching back into Catholicism, whether it's studying St. John or, even the Enneagram has this very Western, my culture, my people, my logos of my culture, and it comes through, and there's this feeling of owning it, like this is my tradition. And, what's been healing in that is, and I was feeling this tonight in Mass, Edmund, so thank you, the different layers in the Catholic tradition, and that to me it's a true revelation, because it's infinite in the sense that it does point you to the One, or to the Absolute, or to the Father in that sense. and it's a vehicle for me in that sense. And yet, like my mom or my grandma, they're on a different place, you know, and it's important to them. It's made them good people, and it's this beauty thing, and yet I can read St. John of the Cross and see something different than my mom would, you know, or study Hildegard, or understand the concept of sin or passions. And then also what's been beautiful about that is, as a therapist, like really appreciating the terminology and the precision that comes from the theology. You know, like sin, like I love the term, and I don't see it in a sense of being guilty or shameful or original sin. I see it, you know, as the sense of off the mark and the neurosis of the psyche and how it works and the suffering that comes from that, and how that separates my own being from the truth. You know, it's my own obscuration in that sense. And so there's this just, it's fun on that level. You know, not too many people I can talk to about that because they don't get it, and you know, we get an argument about sin. You know, it's almost like first there was a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is a mountain. You know, first I believe in sin, then I didn't believe in it, now I do, but from a totally different understanding. And it's just been, you know, grateful too to be, you know, in a teaching that will explore Catholicism when it's appropriate. Like St. John of the Cross knows spiritual poverty better than Buddha. Like the language, the teaching, that's where we go to learn about spiritual poverty. If I'm going to learn about meditative practices, I go to Buddha. And there's a beauty in that, and an appreciation of the tradition, you know, that I come from. And just, you know, the last thing that just feels good, I think, as an American and a Westerner, it often feels, I feel rootless in a lot of ways. Like, I'm not from Utah. My people aren't originally from America, you know. And there's this sense of like, who are we? And yet in Catholicism, at least we've had that for a while, and at least it's our art, and it's come out of our own psyche, you know, and it's come out of our own expression of God and life, and there's something rooting in that. I'm just feeling that today, and maybe it's my family in town, or turning 40 2 days ago, or something. But and I don't know, you know, I don't feel conflictual about it. But Adam and I were talking today, and you know, the danger of having more than one path. I remember a teacher saying, you know, when you die, it can be a conundrum because you don't know which way to work with the death process. It's almost like having two lovers, and you don't know who to marry. And so there's a part of me that's like, wow, what do I need to do with my Catholic tradition? You know, do I need to go back in there and investigate it and understand, you know, and maybe join back in with the church in my own way? I don't know. And that points to what you're saying, Rob. It's like, for me, you know, it's embracing the tradition with our intelligence and awareness that's going to actually grow it. You know, not trying to convince other people that they should be more tolerant, but actually seeing the mystery of St. John and living it, you know, bringing it to life again, the tradition, you know, instead of just...
I think one of the beauties of Catholicism is it can grow.
Yeah.
And it always, you know, I mean, it's taken on board Plato and Aristotle and so on, and, you know, it's in a positive sense made it its own. And I believe that's happening now in the same way it's reaching out to. It can't not do that.
Yeah.
You know, it can't not learn. I mean, it's be unfaithful to itself if it doesn't learn from every encounter of
often
every
it doesn't
other.
seem that way
Yeah.
when you grow up Catholic or from the outside.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
feels very rigid. You know, I got uncle that, you know, a priest uncle that blasted me for doing yoga and meditation. And then I got, you know, great aunts that are Franciscan nuns that think meditation's wonderful and pat me on the head for it. You know, so
And this is
but
totally
there's- Oh, I definitely.
well, there's what's so
That's right.
to me what's been so lovely is to watch that when, you know, women theologians didn't start exegeting scripture probably till about the 1960s. I mean, think of it.
Yeah.
Almost a 2,000-year-old tradition. That's not to say they weren't experiencing scripture. We read Teresa of Avila or Hildegard, you know, they were experiencing scripture, but to just kind of do this kind of postmodern overlay. I mean, read Women, Earth, Creator, Spirit. It's by Elizabeth Johnson. Or read any of Joan Chittister's books, and you can start looking at this notion of this feminine experience of God, and all of the sudden, and that's the organic nature for me personally of Catholicism. It's this it's ever growing, and because it's kind of like, if we're looking at the United States culture through an integral perspective, we're not going to just dismiss somebody who's not integral or somebody who's not at the level, you know, wherever we are. but it's just saying this is the perspectives they're able to take right now. So at the Vatican, and who knows with the Vatican too? We don't know what it's like on their interiors.
Right.
We just don't know. But it doesn't. That's one piece.
And it's something I've appreciated, like the Mavericks, like B. Griffiths or Big Shikamanda or Richard Rohr. My nunnies, turned into him. And it's like they're pushing the envelope while staying within the tradition. It's like, how do they do that? Like, how does Richard Rohr stay in the church? And yet he's pushing it, and it's beautiful. There's this almost like it's like growing pains or something like that. And just talking today, it was just beautiful. All the different orders and just hundreds and hundreds. And it's like, I didn't have the same kind of appreciation until tonight of the organic nature of Catholicism, and that it has so many different faces. And so many different ways of looking at, at the one and interpreting Christ.
I think one of the figures in the Gospel I very attracted to was Peter, not because he was, named as boss. It's because he was a bungler and put in the position he was put. But it's extraordinary. There's 2 moments where he got things seriously right. Every other moment he was making a mess of it. It's true. And the 2 moments were, one, you are the Christ. That's the first moment. And then after he's making a mess all the time, until there's another moment, this is for the whole world. This isn't just for Israel. The other 2 moments he got it right. Every other moment he got it wrong. But
He's got those 2 right.
Got those 2 right, which is a good start.
Of all the ones he got right.
Yeah. But bungled all around the place. Between all, even like Paul, dealing with Paul, he came off the worst of that, rightly so. So I think that's a kind of the thing in germ to see that,
And just to understand too, just the projections that each of the evangelists, they wrote the synoptics 60 years after the death of Jesus, and their own projections as they were writing. When I was reading John of the Cross, when I first encountered John of the Cross, I really didn't like him, because I felt so guilty as I was reading it. And all the stuff I was projecting onto John of the Cross. And then I was also realizing, whether I was reading he or Thomas Merton, both of them, just this sense of their kind of, they were just working it out. And I realized, I was projecting my own sense of flawedness onto them. So there are all of these, and that's what you start to realize of this lived experience, that, Jesus just carries so many projections of the lived experience.
Well, it's like you could say Christianity is the West's way of trying to work it out. This is the best we've done. This is our art. This has been our art and our science. It's noble in that sense.
Yeah, and it's alive.
It is.
It's alive.
I really appreciate your point, and when I look at my own story, if I look back about 100 years, which is about as far back as I can say that this is directly where I begin in some sense. So my great-great-grandfather saw that the war was brewing in Europe, and he came from Croatia to Alberta. In 2008, he sent for his eldest son, who sailed on the Titanic in 1912 and died. He would have been 3rd class. He never would have had a chance to get off the boat. And then the war broke out in 1914. Croatia was on the wrong side of the war, and my great-grandmother, died early in that influenza pandemic. So that left my grandma and her 5 younger siblings, and my grandma was 13. So in wartime Croatia, on the wrong side of the war, no way to contact the father. She had to raise 5 kids at 13. So my dad and I went over in '97 to that town, and my grandparents had never gone back. They just wanted to cut all ties. But my dad and I went back to retrace their steps, and went back to the little village that she was from, and we sat in the pews of the church where she would have gone to. And he pointed at the pews and he said, "This is where you get your faith." Because those moments for her cemented her faith, and she gave it to my dad and he gave it to me. And so that's my story back about 100 years, but we've all got a story that's very parallel to that in some way, that brings us to the room tonight and brings us with a tradition that we might be, to some extent, recovering from or having to have some distance from, but it's in our roots, and whether we come back to it in some full way or not, at some point it becomes a task a developmental task to forgive it and to appreciate it and to know that those symbols are planted very deeply and for a reason. Di will say that the cross, she grew up Mormon, and she will say that to this day the cross is a deeper symbol to her than anything in Buddhism, even after decades of Buddhist practice. And she draws from it, for sure. So it's in all of our stories, and I just love that you're grateful for it, and you know that's there for a reason.
Well, I've always wondered if I have a special connection with my grandma, and wondered if my faith came from her somehow. It's just been one of those curious thoughts, like, did Grandma give me her faith? And when you said that, it makes me wonder if, that faith is born of trials of our ancestors, and something gets lodged in the family psyche that's, hey, I tell my students or clients sometimes, your ancestors weren't sissies. Like, you wouldn't be here if they were sissies. So, man up. It's not that hard right now for you, So, but that's that feeling. It's like, is there something genetic or something in the family culture that the religion also holds that it gets passed through?
And in its wholeness and in its brokenness, something Gail Hochachka said in our program one time is just talking about, she used the word residue, where sometimes you have to go back to that mythic stage and clean up the residue of your woundedness. That was really useful for me to be, because I don't have a real, my story's similar to Raleigh. I don't have a lot of woundedness. It didn't happen until I was 40, of Catholic woundedness. But the woundedness happened it was a mythical level, and it was also a lot of shadow. A lot my own and the shadow of other people. That there was this woundedness to go back. Eventually, at some point, it seems that you to go back, because the scriptures of any of the traditions are alive, because we're encountering them in a second-person experience. And Thomas, if you've ever get a chance to, in this kind of exploration, there's a book by Stephen Mitchell called The Gospel According to Jesus. And he translated the Tao Te Ching, and he translated the Book of Job, and he quotes Thomas Jefferson's experience of reading the scriptures. And Thomas Jefferson says there's kind of something to this Jesus. There's this truth, you can read it, and then other passages that seem to come from inferior minds. So it's the projections and the overlays, and it's a little harsh, the inferior minds, but it was their own projection of the encounter. And when you start to really realize that, rather than this kind of static, this is the book, this is how it was, this, that you might be hearing from home, it then becomes a living tradition. That's your own interaction with the tradition.
When you were talking there about your family and in the church in Croatia, and these are the benches, it sort of spoke of sacrament to me, actually, that there's something, we touch our way through history, and look and taste our way into faith and into community. And I know a number of you were at Mass this evening, and I know you were, a number of you were there because you knew me when I came along.
There was that.
And I was conscious too that you came with hurt, I was very conscious of that, and I was very, very deeply conscious of that, particularly at the start, when we talked about sin. I was confessing our sinfulness. And what you were saying there resonated a lot with me. I mean, I suppose the image I have of sin, if I step in your toe by accident, I apologise. I don't say, well, it was an accident. I say, sorry. But I just felt a huge weight of hurt, I'm very conscious of that. I hope I honoured it. I felt honoured, very deeply honoured that you came along, I think this is the path, entering into this sort of space. This is the way.
Edmund, I just want to say you're a wonderful priest. And my mom, I've never seen her dance last night. And I said, Mom, the priest is dancing to reggae music. And it was the first time I've ever danced with my mom.
Wow.
So thank you, Edmund. I appreciate that. Flexible.
I'm hearing some tonight that people are sometimes making assumptions about, you know, other people's experiences, like in your family's church or in other people's family's church. But I don't think we can know what other people's experiences are and assume that, like, they're not, you know, they're not understanding or they're not having some experience, because a lot of I think the more spiritual experiences are, people tend to not talk about those, and especially maybe to their family members. You know, maybe kids and parents aren't going to be having those conversations together. You know, or we can't understand, even if they did talk to us, we may not understand how that really fits in with their whole life and was a huge experience for them, you know, because of generational barriers or language barriers or, you know, so that's always been, you know, I've always had some issue with the integral. It's like interesting, you know, a theory that puts yourself at the top, you know, so, you know, and then, you know, John's like, well, you're agreeing, and of course, blah, blah, blah. So I, you know, maybe I am agreeing, whatever. But that just comes up all the time for me, including tonight. So I guess I'll just say that, you know.
You know, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that's something, you know, I know that it's always useful to remind us all of, that it's different, these different, not only perspectives, which is kind of a heady thing, but just this kind of heartfelt experiences. And my husband says that a lot as well. Do you see me? Or am I a perspective? Do you see me? Isn't that what we all just want to be seen? From our insides.
Right.
You know.
And I think it you know, it is, you know, fine and great to try to move the church forward, but I think if any of us really went straight into the churches as they are and went deeper into them, yeah, there's always, you know, misunderstanding and but there's always some people that are just going really deep, I think, with any tradition, whether that's, you know, using the rosary beads or, you know, in the Southern Baptist tradition or in all of them, you know. So I don't know that we have to teach them anything, you know. Maybe we have a lot to learn from, you know, what is, you know, how are the Christians doing Christianity right now, you know.
It's kind of like tell me your story.
Yeah.
Our second gathering of Integral Spiritual Center, so it's a very high and mighty gathering, and it ended on Ash Wednesday. And so at first, Brother David, who's one of our big teachers, wasn't going to be able to come. You know, we just felt really, really disappointed that he initially said, I probably can't come if it's going to be Ash Wednesday. So I was chatting with Ken, and Ken said, my position was chief facilitator, so he says, well, you're chief facilitator, so facilitate. So I got on the phone with Brother David, and I said, we'll make sure to honor Ash Wednesday. So after this gathering, which is admittedly very lofty and theoretical, we went to church, the local church in Westminster. Just a humble little church, old, again, wooden pews and all that. And we walked in, and you could feel something as you walked in that church that wasn't present in the room at the Westminster. There was something different. And he looked at me and he said, this is where you find the people who are trying. It was really beautiful. So I love your point. I appreciate it very much.
Just I'm reminded of the Jesus' encounter with the children, which is often sentimentalized. But in fact, I think it's part of the very structure of the story, you know, of Jesus. That when the disciples pushed them away, and there was two things, when he kind of brought them and blessed them, I say we make it very cozy, but in fact it's, you know, it's like, you know, you're dealing with a child who, for instance, who's dying, and you know they're going through something that you've got to, that's sacred, you know, that you can only worship, maybe. I think it's the same thing of, it's holiness. I mean, it comes back to that. That's really what the reality is that shines through, that you find, that breaks out everywhere. And if we kind of do such with that,
just speaking to that too, it's just working at, whether it be in hospice or being with people in the hospital, and you see people from the altar guild or somebody praying the rosary with somebody, you really get this sense of, just like you said, this is the people who are trying, they're out there. And that's what I see in El Salvador a lot when I go down there. Whatever level you want to name it, there's an experience of, like what Raleigh was talking about, of love.
Yeah, I was thinking how much of our spiritual, emotional pathologies, not to mention addiction, or avoidance of pain, avoidance of suffering. And if there's any kind of central message to Christianity, it's, Christ was born, Christ was crucified, Christ arose. And again and again, it just brought me back to being with that suffering and pain internally. And not, I watch the way my ego likes to push things away, but hopefully I've become more, there's more capacity. The icon keeps staring me in the face every time I want to run from it, and that capacity to hold and deepen. Before we started this thing, Pam was saying that, I hope it's not too heady, and I certainly don't feel, anyway, I'm just sitting here with this mystery, and the last thing in my mind is going through an aqua analysis of Christianity or something. It's just not, that's not what this is about at all tonight here. So
we talked about the scriptures a fair amount, but really in the end they're a little bit of an aside from the life of Jesus. That was the message. His life was his message, and he happened to say some things that we wrote down and misinterpreted and forgot and remembered. But so it's just like you say, the incarnation, the death, the resurrection, and that's happening right now too. Right now is the incarnation, and right now is the crucifixion.
Right now is the resurrection.
Right now is the resurrection. It really is. They're really eternal moments, and that was Christ's message, and I think that's the most profound message we can take, and then live those things again as humbly as we can.
And then this notion that too, that each of the lives in here is the message. That's one of the my husband, I think it's been a spiritual practice being married to somebody who just doesn't do spiritual practice, because he mirrors so much for me of somebody who does spiritual practice or does integral, and will see the fundamentalism in me around integral and name the fundamentalism. There's a clear seeing that he seems to have that just seems to be part of his grace. And so just to see that, I don't know that I would say that to him, that Dave is the living Christ, because that would be language that would be uncomfortable for him. But that's how I experience him.
Leonard Cohen again, every heart will come to love, but like a refugee.
And I, being counterphobic 6, basically I said, fuck it. Fuck the church. Fuck the teachers. Fuck the hierarchies. Fuck the scriptures. Fuck it all. If I can't find it in the desert alone with God, then I'm going to burn in hell. I'm doomed. And through that kind of arrogance, somehow there was some grace that I began to find it in the interiors again. And then I began to look out, and I started making some small connections again, and starting to come back. And I read the life of Teilhard de Chardin, who was like completely just dissed by the church over and over again. His books were never published until after his death. That informed us so much. And I was like, God, he balls. He stuck with it, and I didn't. I said, to hell with it, I reject all external authority. And but through grace and mercy, it came up. And there's a story I wrote about. We went to this integral thing in Boulder, and I had this awakening, this Christian awakening when I was like 11 or 12, 68 I think, anyway, and it's great. And it never occurred to me. I looked back to go to a priest and say, Father, what the hell's going on here? I think I met Christ. They haven't met me, you know.
That's a good idea.
Thank you.
And anyway, so I went on and went to Protestant churches, joined a cult, got whacked. Saw my family get whacked. So anyway, at this thing, there was a woman that was, I don't know, going through this. She'd been really wounded in the tradition, and she was getting hugged by Brother David. And so anyway, after I just thought, Brother David, you know, where were you, 40 years ago? You know, when I needed guidance at that point, and I didn't have it. And he hugged me and he said, well, this hug goes back 40 years. And it was a tremendous healing that happened to me. And it was amazing that for the first time I was starting to find it outside of myself, my own encounters with God. I found it in another Christian. And that was just gorgeous. And I was like, okay, so maybe I can start peeling away some of the defenses against, the Christian world and the church. And in my refuge in my heart, I found with Christ that emerges, bidden or not, and reconnect with that. So it's been
forgiveness.
Amen.
And just in Diane's talk today, I was just thinking about that with Brother David. That for me, it was when I got back from integral contemplative Christianity. It was just this experience of him. There's just a quality of being in Brother David. And Diane talking about how she'll sometimes hold, these projections of people will project onto her of this enlightened one, and that all of us who had this experience of Brother David, the notion that is inside of us, that there's that capacity inside of us, because when I'm with somebody like Brother David, I can just go into that whole place of feeling less than, and that would make him so sad. To know that sometimes you can get collapsed into your old world. Could I be this loving